Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our illuminating content. Here is episode 175.
You know, people are different and we want different things. But where we come together is wanting our young people to have what we say is, the way we put it, is lives of purpose and fulfillment. We think that this is a path that increases the probability that they'll get there.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Peter Bergson. Peter has had almost 50 years of career focused on helping people of all ages develop their natural creative process. It began as a Peace Corps trainee when he first realized that compulsory schooling leads most often to compulsory miseducation. A multi-year stint with a consulting firm specializing in creative group problem solving led him to see how that work was remedial, helping young adults achieve the thinking patterns that are natural in our youth and then get unschooled out of us. Thus, in 1975, he and his wife started a nonprofit called Open Connections for the purpose of reinforcing these skills in young people rather than discouraging them. Their original preschool kindergarten program morphed into a center for self-directed learning up to ages 18. In 2016, he opened a new center in inner city Philadelphia to bring this approach to a less privileged population. He is the father of 4 grown unschoolers and the grandfather of 6 more. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm so excited to learn more about your work on processes and opening these learning centers. But before we get into any of that, can you please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. I think what I'd be most useful would be to repeat in a way and reinforce some of what you said in the intro, which is that I stumbled into this whole line of work when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, ostensibly being trained to teach new math to old math Filipino teachers. And it became clear that many, if not most, of my fellow volunteers were really struggling in putting together lesson plans in elementary school math. And they were all college graduates. And I sort of asked myself, what's going on here? And in the midst of that confusion, my girlfriend at the time sent me a copy of the book How Children Fail by John Holt. And from the opening line of that book, which is most children in school fail, I was hooked. And as I read through the first chapter, I came to the conclusion, oh my God, it's not me, it's the system. And what I meant by that was I had gone all the way through college feeling like a fraud, having that very common nightmare that it's the morning of an exam and I hadn't been to class and I hadn't done the reading. I didn't even know where the exam was going to be proctored and I was going to be found out. In reading How Children Fail, I came to see how that belief had been developed throughout my youth. And it was developed by the fact that what was called education for me in my well-to-do suburban public schools through the 9th grade and private prep school through the high school years, I was taught to memorize and regurgitate. And I was good at memorizing and regurgitating when I tried anyway. And so I was considered smart and a good student. But I knew that I often didn't really understand the meaning of most of what I was regurgitating. And that is what led to that nightmare that I was going to be found out, that somebody was going to scratch deeper than the half inch of my knowledge and I would be revealed. And I committed myself at that moment of reading Holt's book to saying, I want to do what I can to save the next generation of young people growing up and thinking and feeling that way. And I knew it wasn't just me because of what I saw.
Yeah, it's all of us have gone through that, feel that.
A lot of people. And I came to believe that basically there are two enemies of real learning. One is uninvited instruction, when somebody compels you to learn something that you haven't asked for, when they start giving you answers to questions that you haven't asked, like what's the largest river in South America and what's the capital of Wyoming, and et cetera, et cetera. And developmentally inappropriate instruction. When, to use Piaget's terms, if you don't have the schemas to make sense of the content that you're expected to produce, then your only options are to either drop out, which is the primary option of people at the lower end of the economic scale, or to fake it, which is the primary option of people at the upper end of the scale, to memorize and regurgitate. And that's what I was seeing with my Peace Corps teammates and what I was, so upset about in my own life. So I knew what I wanted to do. I just had no clue in the world about how to go about doing it. To kind of fast forward through the story, I left the Peace Corps training because I had a bad back, and they decided they didn't want to take a chance with me. And I went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, went to the placement office where they help teachers find positions. And I said, I don't want to come to graduate school here, but I do have this mission. What do you suggest I do? And they said, well, you don't have a teacher certification, so your best shot would be to either find a private school that doesn't require that, or get a job as a substitute teacher in the Boston public schools. Again, without going into a lot of detail, neither of those options worked out. It was after Labor Day, and the private schools were all booked up, most of which I had no interest in working in anyway. And I was most interested in the early years, K through second or even third grade. And I was told that the law in Boston was you had to be a female to teach in those grades. So that was the end of my public school teaching career. So I went back to the ed school, and they said, well, there is a firm in Harvard Square that's doing work writing creative writing textbooks called Synectics. Not quite teaching, but it's certainly more non-traditional than conventional schooling. You might find that interesting. So I did end up getting a part-time position there, during which time I learned that the majority of the work that the company was doing was not for young people. They were teaching their course in creative group problem solving. They were helping primarily adult business people learn how to work more collaboratively and how to think more creatively in their workplace. They had been sent there by their organizations to help them be better at coming up with new ideas for developing new products or marketing existing products, et cetera, et cetera. And I took that course and then eventually came to become an instructor in the course. In the process of doing that, met with a young woman who was working in what I call a liberated Montessori school in Stamford, Connecticut, meaning that they were open to new and other approaches. In conversation, it occurred to the two of us that the work I was doing with adults was remedial. I was helping adults learn to think more like the toddlers that they used to be. And what this teacher, named was Susan Shilcock, who later became my wife, what we discussed was, wouldn't it be interesting if we could develop an educational approach for young people that would reinforce these attributes rather than school them out of them? Within 2 years, Open Connections was born. And that was our primary intention and focus. It was to reinforce and enhance the natural, creative, problem-solving behaviors of young people. It's a process that has been at the heart of my work for 49 years.
Yeah. And to not make it a school, like you said, where, that gets schooled out of them, but to encourage that, correct?
Yeah, well, the issue, school is the sort of catch-all phrase. Schooling, in the sense of uninvited and developmentally inappropriate instruction, that's the boogeyman. So if there's a school that is, supporting self-direction and nurturing creativity, then I'm happy with that school. But usually what people mean by school, and the way most schooling, certainly public schooling and most private schooling, is about the latter. It's about uninvited and developmentally inappropriate instruction.
Yeah. Before we start recording, we were talking about how the process of schooling, like there's a process, and you kind of had a redefinition of education. Do you kind of want to talk about that with us too?
Sure. Happy to. I can actually sum up the area that I think probably have the most likelihood of making a contribution, and that would be the word process. And it starts with a redefinition of education. Almost exclusively, when people use the term education, particularly outside of the sphere of people talking about self-directed learning and such, they're talking about content, reading, writing, history, etc. And they're talking about the mastery of that content and the need for that content in order to be a productive member of society. John Holt was one of the first to point out that if you drew a big circle on a piece of paper and you put a dot of a pencil point in that circle and you said the circle contains all of the known data in the world, and this dot is the amount that any one person could know, and then you put a dot somewhere else where somebody else says, this is what this person thinks is important, and you put a dot somewhere else, and this is what this person. So there isn't even general agreement as to what is the important content. Any efforts to standardize it is defeated before it even gets started. Yeah. But even more important, it's irrelevant. There's a certain amount of content that, is helpful. For example, being able to speak the same language that somebody else speaks, being able to do early elementary school calculations, but it doesn't really go much further than just
the basics.
Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and simple division. And even that is limited largely to whole numbers. One of the activities that I offer to people when they come down hard on the importance of learning the basics is I'll give them a paper and pencil and ask them to write 2/3 divided by 1/2 equals. And I'll ask them to solve that arithmetically, which I usually have to define as meaning act as if that were a worksheet in elementary school, and how would you solve it? And then more significantly, draw a picture or a series of images that prove that your answer is correct. And I've done this with over 3,000 people over the years. And so far, I've had 14 who could do the second part of that accurately. So my comment is, as successful as you are in life, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a whatever, and you can't do 5th grade math, how critical can it be? So content is variable. It's general, it's specific, it's all over the map. You got to have some content. What content depends on your circumstances, what culture you live in, what type of work you want to do. If you don't know what a musical note is and you want to be a composer, it's going to be tough. But exactly. More important than that is process. And to sum that up, I would say that process drives content. So what education is the process of learning and growing and thinking and problem solving and collaborating and basically of living the life that you want. What we need for young people to master in their lives is a process that helps them create the life that they want. I think of education as a process that happens between the ears of each individual. It's the building of connections between bits of data, the development of skills, mixing of personal interests, perceptions, etc. It all goes on inside. And that's what makes us who we are. And the purpose of each person's education is to help them enjoy life and develop a lifelong existence of satisfaction, personal fulfillment, and at least a measure of service to others, which I think is part of what is satisfying to individuals. So what do we need in order to be able to live that kind of life? Well, we need a certain amount of content. We need to speak the language of the people that we live with, of our culture. We need to be familiar with certain bits of content. They change somewhat depending on one's circumstances, which is another thing that makes standardized, quote unquote, standardized education. I would call it standardized schooling. So really impossible. How can you know what I'm going to know or need to know beyond, the most basics of information? I remember, as a quick example, in ninth grade civics class, we studied how a law was made. It wasn't anything I remembered or truthfully cared to know. But then fast forward to the early mid 1980s, when a group of us looked at the state laws and regulations regarding homeschooling in Pennsylvania, and we realized we had to change the law in order to make it much more friendly towards homeschooling. Now I needed to know that content. And of course, it was different content and much more specific than what I would have studied back in the 1950s. And we got our instruction from a state legislator who told us what the steps of the process are. And we worked our way through it, and we learned an incredible amount of very meaningful information in the process of getting that law changed, which fortunately we were successful in doing. At that point, I really understood the making of a law at a level that I never could have as a ninth grader.
Yeah, and it was probably kind of a waste of your time in the ninth grade because you didn't really care. Right?
Exactly. You need to know, or it's helpful to know the basic concept of what is a law and what's the meaning of the term law. But beyond that, it's really catch as catch can in terms of what specifically somebody's going to need to know. My next door neighbor, might never need to know, almost certainly wouldn't need to know what goes into making a new law. Just like I don't know how to remove somebody's appendix. And that's okay. I'm not uneducated because I don't know how to do that. And I don't know how to give a car a tune-up. And I don't know how to design a house that will satisfy the requirements of a certified architect. But that's okay. We don't pass laws that say all adults have to know all those things in order to seek good health care or live in a house or drive a car. You need to know how to find somebody who does know, but you personally don't need to know. We act in schools as if the adults know what the young people are going to need to know. And in imposing that content on them, they interrupt the process of figuring things out and pursuing one's own interests and learning how to pursue one's own interests and of inventing new content, because your brain gets worn out doing all of the memorization and regurgitation, and there's no time or energy left for the innovative thinking.
Yeah, or for the kid to finally figure out what he likes to do, of course. And I'm sure we're going to get more back into what you mean with processes. But before we kind of move into the nuts and bolts of, you're opening up these learning centers, give us an overall paradigm. We have from 1975 when you opened your first one to now. How do you feel like your paradigm has changed about education with time and experience?
Well, the details have been filled in, but the basic conceptualization has only been reinforced. It's like I had no idea how many people in how many disparate fields of study were coming to the same conclusions or had come to the same conclusions with a great deal more research rather than just their own personal experience. For example, Riane Eisler, in her book, The Chalice and the Blade, talking about the two models of society, the dominator model and the partnership model, came to the same conclusion that we came to at Synectics in terms of what makes for an effective creative problem solver and problem-solving group. The same behaviors that we were seeing work to coming up with the best solutions most likely to be implemented in our group process work are the behaviors that Riane Eisler uses to define, albeit somewhat more generally, in the partnership model of society. And the negatives of the dominator model of society that she describes, starting with her own childhood experiences in the Kristallnacht, the night that the Germans invaded the homes of Jewish families like hers and started pulling people out of their homes and imprisoning them, et cetera, et cetera. And she asked herself, why do people behave like this? What's going on? Those are the same behaviors that are exhibited in the competitive business culture and school culture that lead us to correct answers from other people for fear that they're going to get ahead of us, to cheat in school, to try and trick a teacher into thinking that we know more than we really do. When you read about superintendents of schools changing the answers to standardized tests so that their district scores are higher and they don't lose public funding, those are all dominator models of society, destructive behaviors that come from being trained to think that life is a win-lose proposition, and if you win, I lose. Whereas the partnership model says you and I working together can win bigger than either of us working alone. That collaboration actually builds better results than competition, even though competition is our national religion, as I claim it. Another person whose research reinforced my thinking, our thinking, is Alfie Kohn. The first book of his that I read was No Contest. And again, the subtitle is The Case Against Competition. And schools, conventional schools, forced schooling is all about competition. It's all about external motivation. It's all about reward and punishment. It's not about real learning. It's not about finding your passion. It's not about helping your neighbor. It's about win-win by a very limited definition, and win largely at the expense of your neighbor, your seatmate. You're supposed to save your collaboration for, your fellow members of the football team. But even there, you're supposed to then crack skulls with the team representing your friends across the city. It just doesn't make any sense to me. The consequences are that we run the risk here of destroying our planet, of continuous international warfare. I just think that what we call education should be focused on helping people reverse that trend and figure out what to do about that. And a process that develops the skills for solving those challenges, I think, begins with teaching people or supporting people's natural desire to collaborate and to explore and experiment, to understand, all of which we see in toddlers before they go to school. We see the behaviors that we need in adults.
That's pretty powerful. I've never really thought about it. I mean, with the dominator model education, that's what we're all used to. And as parents, we even parent, with the dominator kind of model. So let's kind of talk a little bit about, your desire to open this nonprofit called Open Connections. What did that look like? What does this learning center look like, and how does it operate?
Well, I guess it's not so much the paradigm has shifted, but certainly the implementation has shifted significantly since the late 1970s. We started out as a preschool kindergarten program because that's what Susan and I knew best. I left out of my background the fact that I actually worked for a couple of years in that liberated Montessori school that came to be called the Early Learning Center in Stamford, Connecticut. It has since changed hands. But so I spent a couple of years there before I met Susan. And then Susan had spent a couple of years there by the time she met me. So working with 3 to 5-year-olds was what was most familiar to us. And we also knew that the sooner we got to parents, before they got even further invested in the current paradigm of schooling, the greater the likelihood that we could encourage them to shift their way of viewing their young people and defining what would be appropriate in terms of supporting their education. What we learned fairly shortly as our firstborn got to the outer limits of the age range of Open Connections, i.e. she became close to school age, was that we were asking parents who did come on board to then jump ship and go back to the conventional system or into the conventional system when their young people reached, age 6 or so. And people were saying, what are you going to do with Amanda, when she's
a little older?
Are you going to send her to first grade? And we said, well, in our naivete, we said, no, we're going to look for a progressive private school that will allow for part-time attendance. Well, that was a pipe dream. And then lightning struck, as it did several times during our careers, when one of our parents came in one day waving an early copy of John Holt's relatively new magazine, Growing Without Schooling. He had started this national magazine as a networking mechanism. This was before the internet, whereby people who were interested in homeschooling all around the country could communicate with each other and help each other with the many challenges of working outside the system. And eureka, that was the answer for us. It was homeschooling. And very quickly we learned that in Pennsylvania, we were fortunate that we had more years of grace before we had to face the system than in almost every other state, because compulsory schooling didn't kick in until age 8. But we immediately began to expand our program to include opportunities for young people who were 6 and 7. And then with each passing year, we added older and older young people.
Yeah.
And that's also the time when we got involved in changing the law in Pennsylvania to make it easier for parents to homeschool. Previously, you almost certainly had to be a certified teacher in order to homeschool in Pennsylvania. And that was one of the major parts of the law that we changed. Once homeschooling for everybody became a much more viable option, then we really exploded into a home education resource center with programs way beyond just the early years. And then in the late 90s, we were approached by one of our families where the dad was a businessman who was very concerned about the quality of applicants for employee positions in his organization. He was looking for more creative thinkers, and he came to the conclusion that they were being schooled out of their creativity and that Open Connections, which was the only example that he was aware of, was or should be the wave of the future for how young people, grew and learned. And so he asked if we were interested in expanding to a larger campus so that we could serve many more families and greatly increase our staff and et cetera, et cetera. We talked for over a year to make sure that our beliefs and approaches were sufficiently compatible. And then we jumped off the cliff together. And with the support of yet another Open Connections family that had a significant family foundation, we were able to secure a 28-acre former farm / estate further out in the suburbs. So Open Connections now has gone from 1,000 square foot room to 28-acre campus with woods and ponds and 2 large buildings, one of them a converted barn, serves about 100 families, about 160 young people, is really flourishing. It's done nothing but get better since I left. I happily turned it over to one of my daughters and her husband and a third, I say young man, he's 40, seems young to me. And the 3 of them as co-directors have continued to broaden the opportunities and the programs. So I'm really excited. But in the process of my retirement from that position, I determined that if I was ever going to fulfill the dream of bringing this approach to the underserved, what a euphemism that is, to folks in the inner city, I'd better get going. So in 2014, I started to speak with one of our board members who shared that same interest. And in 2015, we got some early funding to do a study to see if a feasibility study. And we came to the conclusion, there is sufficient interest. And in January of 2016, we opened a center not unlike Open Connections 20 years before. We're in rented church space. We've got about 1,600 square feet. But our mission is in many ways similar, and one specific way very different in that our demographics are so different. We are consciously creating a community that is economically and racially truly diverse, meaning 50% of the families pay less than 50% of the program fees, some all the way down to next to nothing. And close to 50%, more or less, are families of color. I'm on a really steep learning curve of what is going to work and what isn't. But early returns are very positive, and we're very excited about how things are going.
Before we go on, let's listen to this message. Recently, the Luminous Mind became an affiliate for Edgesense, which offers tremendous discounts on educational supplies. I personally use Edgesense to purchase our family supplies because of their great prices, responsive shipping times, and best of all, the chance to earn EduBucks, which I use towards future purchases. Who doesn't love a great deal within a deal? To get a 90% savings on your Edgesense materials, go to theluminousmind.net and click on the sponsor page to find the affiliate link. Start using Edgesense to illuminate your educational experience.
Take one step back and say there's a better way.
Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Peter Bergson, who's helping others keep their natural creativity. Well, and I'd love to hear more about that. I think sometimes when we think of like the learning centers and homeschooling and unschooling, those are like, only the wealthy can afford to really do that. And especially when you look at some of these learning centers, the tuition fees can be kind of steep. How have you made that work is this type of learning center only for highly motivated students with parents that are highly educated? Does it work for, a variety of students?
Yes, there are some kind of loaded terms in there in the discussion. Open Connections has an economically diverse population, and I know some of the other centers do as well. Natural Creativity, which is the name of our center in Philadelphia, has a much wider range of diversity.
Yeah. Well, that's the argument you always hear whenever, at least I've heard, that whenever you talk to public school or educators like that, they're like, well, this is only they just have this idea that only the wealthy, like somehow the people that are struggling the most with their wealth and those types of things are going to be left in the dust.
Right. To me, that harkens back to, and I'm sure you're way too young to remember this, but used to be that the term foreign car meant that you were wealthy. If you bought a foreign car, you could afford a lot more than a typical American car. And then things like the Honda Civic showed up, which underpriced the American cars. And what we found was that people who valued certain types of cars or wanted something different out of their cars than what the American cars were offering, with big gas guzzlers and tail fins and all that kind of stuff, they found a way to come up with the money to buy these foreign cars. And of course, the rest is history, whereas now foreign cars are almost the norm. And a lot of people who aren't wealthy, quote unquote, are driving foreign cars. How did that happen? Well, the foreign cars learned with the money that they made from the highly committed how to make cars that could be affordable to a broader and broader range of people, and yet meet the quality standards of the people who had enough money to buy something other than the sort of cheap stuff that they put out there initially. So families that really want an alternative often can afford a place like Open Connections without giving up the food on their table, without even giving up their second car. Although there are families who do that, there are families who rearrange their lives to be more based on a family business, for example, or they work part-time when their young people are at Open Connections, particularly the single parents. You don't need necessarily 2 full-time employed parents in order to participate. So I always urge people to go beyond the headlines and the assumptions. Usually when people say these places are way too expensive, what they're really saying is, it isn't really what I want. It doesn't really fit for me. And that's okay. As far as natural creativity is concerned, we will never be, by definition and by mission, self-sustaining in the sense of taking in enough in terms of program fees to cover the costs of operation. That's our whole point, or half our point, for half of our population, which is to make it possible for people to come who can't afford it. That money comes from the people who have, well, 2 groups of people, actually. One is initially from people who have or have access to extra money, the ones that are often referred to in unfortunate terms, the 1%ers. Yeah. There are people with a lot of money in this country, and a lot of those people, most of those people, I would say, want to do good things with their money. And so the trick, if you will, or the challenge is to find those people with that money who are interested in addressing the issues that a center like ours addresses. And those people exist. It's a lot of work to find them, but that's the nature of the work. The money is there. Money doesn't disappear. It just tends to concentrate. And we need to just kind of get it flowing a little bit more. But the other thing is we've taken the approach, and we're just starting this now, but we've gotten, again, early returns are looking very promising. The approach that was first used by the so-called silent majority and then was adopted by the Obama campaign. And that is get a little bit of money from a lot of people instead of huge amounts of money from a very few people. So we're doing both, and we're going after our approaches to look for the people who want to support this kind of approach and then let them invest in it at whatever level feels good to them. Again, there's a terrific book on this subject called The Soul of Money by Lynn Twist, like twist of a lemon. And she just keeps hammering home that point that people want to do good and they want to feel good about how they use their money. So put your effort into finding those people who will feel good about sharing some of their money with you, and the money will be there. In terms of just hard numbers, the free schools, the democratic schools, the Sudbury types, for example, their tuitions are usually half or even less than half of the tuitions at a lot of the private school, the conventional private schools. So $8,000 instead of $20,000. Now, for some people with 3 young people, $8,000 per is unavailable, or they think it's unavailable. But even that is something that, can be addressed. That's a whole nother conversation, but it comes down to basically how badly do you want it?
I love what you're saying here too, because, I've seen that a lot in my own life and in different people that I've interacted with, that even the poor find a way to educate themselves or to find that education that's available to them, that's a top-notch school or a top-notch situation like what you're talking about with your open connection school, then also the Sudbury school, those types of things. Because I've seen that, that education is important and parents do love their kids. It's probably harder to find parents that don't care than parents that do care, correct?
Absolutely. Across the board, I've never met a parent whose number one goal isn't for their young person to be happy.
Yeah. And to be better off than what they were, right? I mean, to have the opportunities that maybe they weren't given.
Well, if that's their sense of their own life, then yes, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit right before we close up here about your website, naturalcreativity.org. How are you trying to grow this movement, and what are you doing to kind of help spread the word of getting rid of our dominated type education to more of the process?
A couple of different things. As far as Natural Creativity Center is concerned, like every type of business, word of mouth is absolutely the number one marketing tool. And we have benefited from numerous referrals from our current family. So, the first thing that we can do there in terms of spreading the word about our center is to do what we do well and do our best to create happy customers, if you will. And then they tell their friends and et cetera. Broader than that, I'm more than happy to speak with anybody who wants to start their own center of any sort, as long as, these are the goals. If somebody wants to start a military academy, they're probably going to have to call somebody else. And also, I'm happy to refer people to places like Aero, AERO, for their school starters course, or North Star for their replication program, which is more specific and shorter term and a lot less costly. But, if you want to start your own program, there are people running programs who are more than happy to help you get going and to share, what they've learned and all that sort of thing. And I encourage people to talk to as many of those as they can, because each of us has, pieces to the puzzle. And thinking even more broadly than that, in terms of encouraging parents to think outside of the conventional teach them, test them school paradigm, forced schooling. I and another one of interviewees, Peter Gray and Pat Ferenga from Holt Associates, and some other folks several years ago started kind of think tank conversation group that we called the Tipping Point Project about how can we support self-directed education. And we created a website called alternativestoschool.com. And that website has not only a lot of content about this approach and background information and research, but also a directory of some of the programs around the country of different sorts that people can go to rather than think they necessarily have to start their own. But then that group has morphed into a new national organization called the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. And Peter Gray is the best known member of that group, but there's some others who are working on it. I was involved in the decision to create that right at the time that I made the decision to start the Natural Creativity Center. And there was no way I could do justice to both projects at the same time. So I'm in the background clapping and cheering for Peter and Pat and colleagues while I keep paddling here in Philadelphia for the Natural Creativity Center.
And your legacy fits nicely with theirs, correct? Is that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're an example of the type, both Open Connections and Natural Creativity are examples of the types of organizations that they're promoting and encouraging people to explore as ways of supporting self-directed education. Peter Gray initially got into this, as so many people do, through his own offspring. His son Scott was very unhappy in school, and Peter eventually discovered the Sudbury School, Sudbury Valley School, in his own backyard in central eastern Massachusetts. And that's how he got involved in this. But as that interest grew, as an evolutionary psychologist, very much concerned with the partnership education model and seeing the benefits of it in hunter-gatherer societies, that brought him into self-directed education. And so the Sudbury model is the one that's, I think, nearest and dearest to Peter's heart. But he knows that there's no one-size-fits-all in these so-called alternatives to compulsory schooling than it works for standardized schooling.
Yeah.
Different people in different circumstances want different things. We've had people come to Natural Creativity from other self-directed centers because specifically of our enhanced racial mix. So that's something that's been really important to them. And that's not just the families of color, that includes some of the white colors. People are different and we want different things. But where we come together is wanting our young people to have what we say is, the way we put it, is lives of purpose and fulfillment. We think that this is a path that increases the probability that they'll get there. So that's what we do.
Oh, I love how you're working together. I mean, kind of goes back to the dominator versus, collaborative type of education. Before we say goodbye, maybe do you have some final parting words for our listeners? Not all of us live close to some of these open learning centers or self-directed learning centers. What would be your advice to listeners to give the best education that they possibly can to their kids with this still collaborative, self-directed look?
I think the first thing is to dig as deeply as you can into the range of options. Learn as much as you care to about what other people are doing and see. It's kind of like house hunting. Some people already know exactly what they want in a house. And they can describe it to the realtor and say, don't call me until you find something that fits these specs exactly. But that's rare. More often than not, people have to go look at a bunch of different houses, different types of houses in different settings, before they realize, what's really important to me is a big eat-in kitchen. I want the kitchen to be the center of the house where everybody congregates and this and that and this and that. Or somebody else might say, what's really important to me is that everybody has his or her own bedroom or, whatever. But you figure out what it is that really makes your heart sing. The same is true with determining a path for your young people's education. And by the way, it may be a somewhat different path for different young people.
Even in the same family, right?
In the same family. I know some families where the young people are very happy in their school and others are homeschooling. It creates a separate set of issues, or can, but if that's what works best for them at any given moment, great. So find out as much as you can. Then if people determine that, for want of a better term, homeschooling, which Holt started using the term and immediately knew that it had problems because it was interpreted by so many people to mean school at home.
Or that the parents were being the primary teacher type.
Exactly. In the early days, with so many religious conservatives being the primary perpetrators, if you will, of home users of homeschooling, that was reality. But as more and more secular-minded folks got into the movement, the term unschooling, which John also put together and found equally unsatisfactory, started to come into vogue. But for the purposes of this conversation, let me just say people who are registered or not, depending on what their state requires, as choosing an education path other than enrollment in any form of school, brick and mortar, cyber school, public, private, parochial, whatever, anything other than that, let's call those people homeschoolers or home education families. If a family decides that that's the path they want to take, almost every community has other people already doing that and has support groups of one sort or another that may just be conversations among the adults. They may be in person or they may be online, but find kindred spirits is my suggestion there.
Collaboration is always, it helps you move forward.
You and I working together can win bigger than either one of us working alone.
Yeah, love that.
Then if, on the other hand, you want to be part of a community, more than just and I don't mean this pejoratively, but the sort of haphazard get-togethers, you always have to schedule it week after week. There's no regular, consistent plan. And you want that sense of community for your young people, the same people on a regular basis that they get together to work and play with and such. Then you may want to track down a center or a democratic school, a free school, they go by different names, in your area. If there isn't one, then think 2 or 3 times before you do this. But consider finding some allies and creating your own. You've got to want to do that, in my estimation. You've got to want to do that for more than just your own young people, because it does require a lot of effort in areas that don't directly relate to your young person. I mean, just simple things like the maintenance of a piece of property, even if you are only renting it, is more than looking after your own home. Managing money that comes in from other people is more than just managing your own money. You get into issues of insurance and a whole number of things. They're not all problems, though. They're also all opportunities. And the benefits and the payoffs of a community that works are worth the extra effort. But you've got to want to do that extra effort. And a lot of people don't. I want my car repaired, but I do not want to run a car repair shop. So I'll look for a good mechanic, but I'm not about to go to the effort of opening my own place of business. But maybe what you want to do is help another center get started without your being primarily responsible for it. And there again, find some like-minded families. Put a notice up in your local Whole Foods, your local libraries, your local YMCA, or I guess they're all Ys now, and places where you think like-minded souls might do business or congregate, and say, here's what I'm interested in doing. Does this sound of interest to you? Are you concerned about, all the pressure on young people today to get high test scores and 4 hours of homework and this and that? There are other ways to grow and learn that seem to me to be much more humane and enjoyable for the whole family, not just the young people. Would you like to get together and talk about these things? And start that, and you may then find there's somebody who would like to start a center, would like to do that work, but didn't know there was anybody else interested. And I'm happy to talk with folks about how that process, can happen and what some of the pitfalls are too.
That'd be great.
Almost invariably, there's a split early on. As people start to work together and make decisions, they find out that they're not in as much agreement with some of the folks as they thought they were. They want different things, and that's okay. Don't try and force it. Just, go your own way and find the people who are more simpatico with what you want and how you want to go about it.
Well, and give our audience a way of how they can get in touch with you. What is some contact information they can find you to hopefully get some help to do these things?
Sure. Well, they can go to info at either website, naturalcreativity.org or openconnections.org, and it will get to me eventually. Or they can write to me directly at Peter B as in Bergson, at naturalcreativity.org.
Great. Well, what a conversation. I mean, there's so many things that we can discuss, but I think we need to end it here. Once again, his company website is naturalcreativity.org or openconnections.org. His email address is peterb@naturalcreative.org. However, we're going to be sure to link all the information that we've discussed today on our website, including, books and different things up on our website as well. But thank you so much, Peter, for joining us and helping us light our minds on fire on this topic of education. I so appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I tend to think I'm speaking to minds that are already on fire and hoping I'm just fanning the flames and encouraging people to keep following their dreams, because I know there's a lot of conversation out there in the other direction. We need to hold hands and keep walking forward together.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Peter Bergson, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and get our new monthly newsletter. Then check out the Services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help us continue production of illuminating content, go to the Sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us, leave us a review, share our content. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.